Her hands were trembling so violently the ceramic rattled against the saucer. Then the plane hit a pocket of air, and time seemed to slow down. The white, scalding latte didn't just spill, it arched through the air like a death sentence, soaking into the dark wool of the stranger's sleeve. Seraphine gasped, her voice barely a whisper as she reached out with a napkin to do the unthinkable, touch him. I am so sorry, sir. Please let me. The cabin fell into a suffocating silence. The flight crew froze. The armed men in the front row reached instinctively for their holsters, but the man she had just marked was no ordinary passenger. He was Vittorio Calderon, the Don of Silence, a man who had ended lives for far less than a ruined suit. What he did next, instead of shouting or reacting, would systematically dismantle her entire world by the time the plane touched the runway. Stay with me until the end, because the way this Don chooses to punish her will shock you to your core. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments. What would you do if you realized you just crossed the most dangerous man in the country? Now let's get into it. Vittorio Calderon did not govern the city through the loud, messy theatrics of his predecessors. He ruled it through a terrifying, absolute absence of sound. In the concrete labyrinth of Chicago, where the sirens usually wailed and the streets screamed with the friction of a million desperate lives, Vittorio was the dead air in the middle of a radio frequency. They called him the Don of Silence, not because he didn't speak, but because when he did, it was usually the last thing a man ever heard. He was a man who understood that true power isn't a shout. It is a whisper that travels through the shadows and settles in the bones of his enemies like an incurable winter chill. At 60, his presence was less like a storm and more like the heavy, pressurized calm that precedes a devastating earthquake. He sat in the shadows of the palazzo, his private estate, or in the pressurized cabins of high-altitude jets, pulling strings that moved judges, senators, and the darkest elements of the underworld with the precision of a master surgeon. To understand Vittorio was to understand the weight of a gaze that never blinked. His eyes were the color of flint, cold and unyielding, reflecting a life spent in the crucible of high-stakes violence and cold-blooded strategy. His salt-and-pepper hair was always slicked back with a discipline that bordered on the religious, every strand a testament to a man who tolerated no disorder in his world. He dressed in fabrics that cost more than a flight attendant's annual salary, bespoke wool and silk that felt like armor against a world he viewed with a mixture of boredom and calculated contempt. He did not flinch at the sight of blood, nor did he celebrate the acquisition of wealth. To Vittorio, everything was simply a transaction, a balance sheet of debts owed and lives spent. His reputation was built on a singular, unwavering rule. Every action had a consequence, and every mistake carried a price that could never be discounted. The stories told about him in the dim, smoke-filled backrooms of the city's dive bars were the stuff of modern folklore. There was the tale of the rival captain who tried to skim off the top of a construction contract. Vittorio hadn't raised a hand or a voice. He simply sat across from the man at dinner, eating his pasta in total silence for 40 minutes, until the captain suffered a heart attack from the sheer, crushing pressure of the Don's unspoken judgment. Then there was the legend of the city official who dared to reject a zoning permit. Within 48 hours, the man's entire career, his reputation, and his bank accounts had vanished as if they had never existed, leaving him a ghost in his own life. Vittorio didn't just kill people, he erased them. He deleted their futures, burned their legacies, and left the world as though they had never stepped foot upon its surface. This was the man who now sat in the plush leather seat of the Gulfstream, watching a white stain spread across his sleeve like a growing cloud of failure. In the city below, the name Calderon was whispered with a sign of the cross. He was the shadow behind the skyscrapers, the silent partner in the luxury hotels, and the invisible hand in the shipping docks. He lived by a code that was ancient and brittle, a philosophy that sentiment was a poison, and mercy was a luxury the powerful could rarely afford. He had no wife, no heirs, and no friends, only associates and subjects. His life was a masterpiece of isolation, a fortress of cold logic that he had spent decades constructing. He believed that to be loved was to be vulnerable, and to be vulnerable was to be dead. Instead, he chose to be a god of the silent vacuum, a figure of such immense, gravity-heavy authority that his mere entrance into a room could drop the temperature by 10 degrees. He was the apex predator of a jungle made of glass and steel, a man who had forgotten the sound of his own laughter, but remembered the exact details of every betrayal he had ever suffered. The crew of the private charter had been briefed for weeks on his requirements. No eye contact unless spoken to. No unnecessary movement. The cabin was to be kept at exactly 68 degrees. The espresso was to be served at a specific temperature in a specific porcelain cup. These were not the whims of a diva, but the requirements of a man who used order to suppress the chaos he dealt with daily. When Seraphine Hale had walked onto that plane, she hadn't just stepped into a workplace. She had stepped into a sacred temple of control. She was young, vibrant, and possessed a light that had no place in Vittorio's monochromatic existence. To him, she was a variable, an unpredictable element in a controlled environment. He had watched her from the moment she boarded, not with lust, but with the clinical observation of a hawk watching a sparrow. He saw the way her hands shook slightly as she reached for the tray, the way her eyes darted to the armed guards, and he knew, with the predatory instinct that had kept him alive for 60 years, that the silence was about to be broken. When the latte finally spilled, it wasn't just a liquid hitting fabric. In Vittorio's mind, it was a rupture in the fabric of his reality. It was a messy, hot, chaotic intrusion into his ordered world. As the cream-colored foam slid down his $10,000 charcoal suit, he didn't feel anger. Anger was a hot emotion, a weak emotion. Instead, he felt a cold, sharpening focus. He looked at the girl, really looked at her, and saw the reflection of 1,000 other people who had failed him. But there was something in her terror, something in the way her blonde hair had escaped its neat styling, and the way her red scarf vibrated against her throat, that stirred a memory he had buried under 30 years of ice. He didn't know yet that this girl carried the blood of the only man he had ever truly owed. He only knew that she had dared to be clumsy in the presence of a god, and for that, her life as she knew it had to end. He didn't need to reach for a gun to destroy her. He simply needed to remain silent and let the world he controlled finish the job for him. He was Vittorio Calderon, and in his world, a spilled latte was the first ripple of an incoming tidal wave that would leave nothing but wreckage in its wake. The descent did not begin with a scream or a grand gesture of violence. It began with the clinical, rhythmic tapping of a keyboard in a darkened office 3,000 miles away. For Seraphine Hale, the walk through the airport terminal after the private jet touched down felt like a slow-motion stroll through a dream that was rapidly souring into a nightmare. Her uniform felt tight, the red scarf around her neck suddenly resembling a noose rather than a professional accessory. She kept replaying the moment in the cabin, the way Vittorio's eyes had remained fixed on hers even as the scalding milk soaked into his skin. He hadn't flinched. He hadn't even wiped it away. He had simply watched her, his silence creating a vacuum that sucked the oxygen right out of her lungs. She had stammered an apology that went unanswered, and as she stepped off the aircraft, she felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the air-conditioned hangar. She tried to tell herself it was just a job, just a spill, but the hollow feeling in her chest told her that the dawn of silence didn't believe in accidents. The first crack in her reality appeared at the security gate. It was a routine check, a swipe of her elite flight credentials that usually granted her seamless passage into the crew lounge. She pressed her plastic ID card against the electronic reader, expecting the familiar green chirp of approval. Instead, the machine emitted a harsh, guttural red buzz. She tried again, her brow furrowing, a nervous laugh escaping her lips as she looked at the stone-faced security officer. The officer took the card from her hand, swiped it through his own terminal, and frowned. He didn't look back up at her with sympathy. He looked at her with the sudden, sharp suspicion one reserves for a trespasser. He told her the card had been deactivated, flagged at the highest level for a terminal security breach. Within seconds, 2 more guards appeared, their hands hovering near their belts. They didn't offer explanations. They simply took her badge, snapped it in half, and escorted her to the public exit. Seraphine stood on the curb of the bustling airport, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, realizing that in the span of 30 minutes her professional identity had been erased. Panic is a cold, creeping thing that starts in the fingertips. Seraphine pulled her phone from her pocket, her breath coming in shallow hitches as she tried to call her agency. She needed to explain. She needed to tell them about the turbulence, the latte, the impossible pressure of the Calderon flight. But as she pressed the call button, a message flashed across the screen. Service suspended. She stared at the device in disbelief. It was a company-issued line, part of her elite package. She tried to log into her banking app to check her personal funds, thinking she could just call a ride and figure this out from her apartment. The app opened, but the numbers that greeted her were a series of zeros. Her checking account, her modest savings, the money she had painstakingly set aside for her father's upcoming heart surgery, it was all gone. Not stolen, but frozen. A pending investigation, notice sat where her life savings used to be, citing suspicious international activity. Vittorio hadn't just fired her. He had reached into the digital veins of her life and pinched them shut. She walked for an hour, her heels clicking rhythmically against the pavement, a stark contrast to the chaotic whirlwind in her mind. Every shadow seemed to take the shape of the man in the charcoal suit. She reached her apartment complex, a modest building on the edge of the city, hopping for the sanctuary of her own 4 walls. But as she reached for the door, she saw a bright orange notice taped to the glass. It was an eviction summons, citing a sudden and total foreclosure of the property. The building manager, a man who had shared coffee with her just last week, wouldn't even look her in the eye through the window of his office. He simply pointed to the fine print. The holding company that owned the complex had been bought out an hour ago by a subsidiary of Calderon Holdings. The new owners were clearing the building for immediate renovations. Her key turned in the lock, but the tumblers didn't click. The locks had already been changed. Her clothes, her photographs, her father's old records, everything was locked inside a fortress she no longer had the right to enter. The efficiency of the destruction was breathtaking. It was a surgical strike carried out with the cold indifference of a god. Seraphine sat on a park bench, the twilight air turning bitter, realizing that she was now a ghost in her own city. She had no job, no money, no home, and no way to call for help. The realization of Vittorio's power hit her with the force of a physical blow. He didn't need to lay a hand on her to kill her. He was simply removing the world from beneath her feet. He was proving that her entire existence was a privilege he allowed, and with a single breath, he had revoked it. Every person she knew, every institution she trusted, had been turned against her by the mere mention of his name or the movement of his capital. She looked at her hands, still smelling faintly of roasted coffee and expensive milk, and realized the latte hadn't just ruined a suit. It had acted as a chemical catalyst, dissolving the thin veneer of safety she had spent 24 years building. As the streetlights flickered to life, casting long, predatory shadows across the grass, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. It didn't roar, it glided, silent as a shark in deep water. The window rolled down just an inch, revealing nothing but the darkness within. Seraphine didn't run. There was nowhere left to run. She stood up, her legs weak but her gaze fixed on the vehicle, knowing that the dawn of silence was done with the digital world and was ready for the personal one. She had been blacklisted from society, deleted from the economy, and isolated from her peers. She was now exactly where Vittorio wanted her, in the vacuum he created. The door of the sedan opened with a soft, expensive click, inviting her into the dark. She understood then that the cancellation of her future was only the beginning. He hadn't just ended her old life. He was drafting a new one, and she was the ink he intended to use. With a final look at the city that no longer recognized her, Seraphine stepped toward the car, surrendering to the silence. The interior of the black sedan smelled of expensive leather, aged cedar, and the faint, metallic scent of a world where mercy had long ago been bled dry. Seraphine sat in the plush backseat, her body rigid, feeling like a condemned prisoner being transported to a high-security execution. The city blurred past the tinted windows, a kaleidoscope of neon lights and bustling crowds that now felt as distant as a different planet. She was no longer a part of that world. She was a ghost caught in the gravity of Vittorio Calderon. Beside her sat one of the Don's men, a mountain of a human whose silence was just as oppressive as his master's. They didn't speak, and they didn't need to. The destination was inevitable. When the car finally slowed, it wasn't at a warehouse or a dark alleyway, but in front of a sprawling, neoclassical estate that loomed over the Hudson like a fortress of old-world arrogance. This was the Palazzo, the seat of the Calderon Empire, where the air felt heavy with the weight of secrets and the echoes of those who had vanished within its limestone walls. As she was led through the cavernous foyer, her heels clicking nervously against the polished marble, Seraphine felt a crushing sense of insignificance. The walls were adorned with Renaissance art depicting scenes of conquest and sacrifice, illuminated by crystal chandeliers that cast sharp, jagged shadows. She was ushered into a private study, where the walls were lined with thousands of leather-bound books, their spines gold-embossed and smelling of ancient dust. At the far end of the room, seated behind a desk carved from a single slab of black obsidian, was Vittorio. He didn't look up when she entered. He was focused on a single sheet of paper, a fountain pen poised in his hand like a surgeon's scalpel. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that sounded like the steady beat of a giant, mechanical heart. Finally, he set the pen down and lifted his flint-colored eyes to hers. There was no anger in them, only a terrifying clinical curiosity. "You look tired, Miss Hale," he said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards beneath her feet. "It is understandable. Losing one's career, one's home, and one's identity in a single afternoon can be quite taxing." Seraphine felt a surge of indignation pierce through her fear, a desperate spark of the girl she used to be. She gripped the edge of the obsidian desk, her knuckles white. "Why are you doing this?" She whispered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain steady. "It was a cup of coffee, an accident. I offered to pay for the suit. I apologized. Why destroy everything I've ever worked for over a stain?" Vittorio leaned back, the shadows of the room dancing in the deep lines of his face. He looked at her as if she were a child trying to explain the laws of physics to a hurricane. "It was never about the suit, Seraphine. It was about the audacity of imperfection in a space where I demand absolute order. However, the suit led me to look into you. And when I look into something, I do not stop until I find the roots." He slid a manila folder across the desk. With shaking fingers, Seraphine opened it. Inside were photographs of a small, weather-beaten cottage on the outskirts of the city, her childhood home, where her father, Henry, was currently bedridden, recovering from the initial stages of heart failure. Tucked behind the photos were legal documents, stamped with the seals of banks she recognized and names of holding companies she didn't. Her eyes scanned the text, the legalese blurring until a single figure leaped off the page: the total remaining balance of her father's mortgage. Next to it was a fresh signature and a corporate seal belonging to a subsidiary of the Calderon organization. "The bank was preparing to foreclose on your father's property due to the mounting medical debts you've been struggling to cover," Vittorio explained, his tone as casual as if he were discussing the weather. "I found the situation inefficient, so I purchased the debt. In its entirety, I am now your father's sole creditor." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Seraphine felt the breath leave her body, a cold, hollow vacuum forming in her stomach. Her father was the only thing she had left, a man who had spent his life as a humble mechanic, teaching her that honesty and hard work were the only things that mattered. Now his very shelter, the bed he lay in, and the air he breathed were owned by the monster sitting across from her. "You can't do this," she breathed, the words tasting like ash. He has nothing to do with this. He's a good man. He's sick. Vittorio stood up, his tall frame cutting a terrifying silhouette against the moonlight streaming through the window. He walked around the desk, his movements fluid and predatory until he was standing inches away from her. The scent of his expensive cologne and the heat of his presence overwhelmed her. A debt is a debt, Miss Hale. In my world, it is the only bond that truly matters. Your father owes me a home. You owe me for the disruption of my peace. He reached out, his long, scarred fingers lifting her chin so she was forced to look into the abyss of his gaze. I didn't just cancel your future to be cruel, he murmured, his voice dropping to a near whisper that felt like a caress and a threat all at once. I did it to clear the slate. You have no job to return to, no apartment to hide in, and no bank to lean on. You are entirely, beautifully alone with me. And now, you have a choice. You can walk out of that door and I will initiate the eviction of Henry Hale tonight. He will be on the street before the sun rises, and we both know his heart will not survive the journey to a shelter. He let his hand drop, the absence of his touch feeling colder than the touch itself. Or, he continued, turning back toward the window to watch the dark waters of the Hudson, you can accept that your life now belongs to the Calderon estate. You will work for me. You will live here. You will learn what it means to serve the silence. Seraphine looked at the folder. The image of her father's frail smile burned into her mind. She thought of the latte, the spill that had seemed so small, and realized it had been the key that unlocked a cage she never knew she was already standing in. The dawn of silence had planned this with the precision of a chess master, moving her like a pawn until she had no squares left to occupy. She wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She was a piece of collateral in a game she didn't understand. The stakes weren't just her career or her credit score, they were the life of the man who had raised her. She closed the folder, the sound of the paper snapping shut echoing like a gavel. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice hollow and defeated. Vittorio didn't turn around, but she could see his reflection in the glass, a faint ghost-like smile touching the corners of his mouth. Everything, Seraphine, he replied. I want everything. Under the watchful eyes of the palazzo's ancestors, the deal was struck in the dark. The transition from the backseat of the sedan to the threshold of the palazzo was a journey into a world where the sun never truly seemed to rise. Seraphine stood before the towering iron gates, which groaned open with a heavy, mechanical finality that signaled the end of her life as a private citizen. The estate was a sprawling monument to power, a labyrinth of limestone and shadow that sat perched on a cliffside, overlooking the churning, gray waters of the river below. As she stepped into the grand foyer, the air changed. It was cooler here, smelling of expensive wax, old paper, and the sharp, ozone scent of a coming storm. She was no longer Seraphine Hale, the ambitious flight attendant with a plan for her future. She was a suppliant entering the lion's den, her only weapon a desperate hope that there was a shred of humanity left beneath Vittorio Calderon's tailored exterior. The silence of the house was not empty. It was a physical weight, a pressurized atmosphere that made her ears ring and her heart pulse in her throat like a trapped bird. A man in a dark suit, whose face was as expressionless as a carved tombstone, led her through a series of interconnected galleries. They passed under the watchful eyes of oil-painted ancestors, men with Vittorio's flinty gaze who seemed to track her movement with silent judgment. Every footfall on the Persian rugs felt like an intrusion, a messy vibration in a temple of absolute control. Finally, they reached a set of double doors made of dark, heavy oak. The guard opened them without a word and stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. The room was a vast library, the walls disappearing into the shadows of the high ceiling. At the far end, framed by a floor-to-ceiling window that looked out over the jagged cliffs, stood Vittorio. He was silhouetted against the moonlight, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, looking like a king surveying a kingdom he had long ago grown tired of ruling. He did not turn when she entered, but the tension in the room spiked, a silent acknowledgement of her presence that felt like a hand tightening around her windpipe. Seraphine cleared her throat, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. I am here, she said, her voice sounding small and fragile against the vastness of the room. You've taken my home, my job, and you hold my father's life in your hands. What is there left to negotiate? Vittorio turned then, his movements slow and deliberate, the ice in his glass clinking with a rhythmic, chilling precision. He walked toward her, the light of the fire in the hearth catching the silver at his temples and the sharp, uncompromising lines of his face. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of her, so close she could smell the smoke and cedar of his cologne. Negotiation implies that both parties have something the other desires, he murmured, his voice a low, dangerous velvet. In this room, Miss Hale, I have everything, and you have nothing but your compliance. I did not bring you here to talk about what I have taken. I brought you here to show you what you will become if you wish to save the man you love. He gestured to a small, delicate table where a new contract lay waiting, the ink still fresh. Seraphine looked down at the document, her eyes blurring as she tried to read the dense, legalistic prose. It wasn't just a labor contract. It was a total surrender of her autonomy. It outlined her duties as his personal assistant, a role that appeared to be 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with no contact with the outside world. In exchange, her father's mortgage would be cleared, his medical bills paid in full by the best surgeons in the country, and his safety guaranteed by the Calderon name. It was a golden cage, polished to a brilliant shine, but a cage nonetheless. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears of rage and fear. You want me to be your servant, to wait on the man who methodically dismantled my life because I made a mistake with a drink. This isn't work, Vittorio. This is slavery. Vittorio's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened, a flicker of something resembling respect crossing his features before it was replaced by his trademark coldness. The world is a marketplace of debt, Seraphine. You were already a slave to the banks, to the airline, to the crushing weight of a system that would have let your father die in a hallway without a second thought. I am simply a more honest master. I offer you a direct exchange, your freedom for his life. Most would consider that a bargain. He walked to the window, staring out at the dark horizon. You think of yourself as an innocent, but innocence is just a lack of opportunity. Here, in this house, you will learn the true nature of power. You will see how the world really turns, and you will realize that the girl who spilled that latte died the moment she stepped off that plane. The question is, who will you choose to be in her place? Seraphine felt the walls of the library closing in, the thousands of books feeling like a jury of silent witnesses. She thought of her father's tired eyes, the way he had always told her she was meant for greatness, and the crushing reality that his heart was failing in a house he no longer owned. She realized then that Vittorio wasn't just testing her loyalty, he was testing her will. He wanted to see if she would break or if she would bend. She picked up the fountain pen, the cool weight of the metal feeling like a brand in her palm. If I do this, she said, her voice reaching a level of steadiness that surprised even herself. I want your word, not as a businessman but as a man. My father is never to know the price I paid. He stays in his home, he gets the surgery, and he is never touched by your world. Vittorio turned back to her, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that felt like a physical connection. My word is the only thing in this city that does not have a price tag, Miss Hale. It is absolute. Seraphine leaned over the desk and signed her name, the ink blooming on the page like a bloodstain. As she set the pen down, she felt a strange, hollow sense of peace. The struggle was over. The negotiation was finished. She had entered the lion's den, and the door had been locked from the inside. Vittorio stepped closer, his hand reaching out to tilt her chin upward one last time. Welcome to the palazzo, Seraphine, he whispered, the coldness in his voice replaced by a dark, proprietary warmth. Try not to spill anything tonight. We have a great deal of work to do. The lion had caught his prey, and the silence of the estate swallowed her whole. The following morning, the palazzo was bathed in a deceptive, silver light that did little to warm the cold marble corridors. Vittorio sat in his study, the air thick with the scent of bitter espresso and the ozone of an impending coastal storm. He was a man who lived by the accumulation of data, believing that information was the only true shield against the unpredictability of human nature. Before him lay the expanded file on Seraphine Hale, a document he had ordered his intelligence team to deepen the moment she had signed her life away. He wanted to know every heartbeat of her history, every fracture in her character, and every ghost that followed her. He flipped through the pages of her academic records and her employment history with a clinical detachment, but as he reached the section regarding her family lineage, the atmosphere in the room seemed to undergo a violent, atmospheric shift. A single black and white photograph fell from the folder, landing face up on the obsidian desk. And for the first time in 30 years, the dawn of silence felt the world tilt on its axis. The photograph was grainy, a relic from a humid night in the late 90s, showing a younger, bloodied version of himself leaning against the grease-stained shoulder of a man in a mechanic's jumpsuit. The man in the image was Henry Hale. Vittorio's mind raced back to a rain-slicked alleyway in a part of the city he had long since conquered. He had been young then, ambitious and reckless, caught in an ambush that should have ended his life. He had been shot twice, his life essence spilling onto the cold pavement when a humble mechanic closing his shop had intervened. Henry hadn't known who Vittorio was. He had only seen a dying man. Without a word, the mechanic had dragged him into the bowels of a garage, hidden him from the hit squads, and spent 3 days nursing him back to stability using nothing but a first aid kit and sheer, stubborn compassion. When Vittorio had finally been strong enough to leave, he had offered the man a fortune. Henry had refused every cent, stating simply that a life was not something one sold for profit. Vittorio stared at the image, his flinty eyes tracing the lines of the man who had been his silent savior. He looked at the medical reports in the folder, the failing heart, the mounting debts, the desperate struggle for survival. Then his gaze drifted to the door where Seraphine had stood only hours before, begging for the life of the very man who had once breathed life back into the Calderon legacy. The irony was a jagged blade, twisting in a part of his soul he had long ago declared dead. He had spent the last 24 hours systematically destroying the daughter of the only man to whom he owed a blood debt. He had stripped her of her dignity, her career, and her future, all because of a spilled latte that paled in comparison to the debt of a life. For a man who built his entire philosophy on the absolute balance of debts and credits, the realization was a catastrophic error in his own ledgers. He was no longer the hunter. He was a man standing in the wreckage of his own honor. He rose from his chair, his movements uncharacteristically hurried as he paced the length of the library. The silence he cherished now felt like a mocking audience, echoing the whispers of the past. He had intended to use Seraphine as a tool, a psychological experiment in total submission, but the ghost in the files had changed the nature of the game. He looked at the signature on the contract, the ink he had thought of as a bloodstain. It was a bloodstain, but it was his own. He realized that Seraphine possessed the same quiet, resilient fire that had defined her father. She hadn't broken under his pressure because her spirit was forged from the same humble, unbreakable iron. The dawn of silence found himself in an impossible position. To release her now would be to admit a lapse in his omniscience, a weakness his enemies would scent like blood in the water. But to keep her as a servant was a violation of the ancient code that governed his very existence. He walked to the window, watching the gray waves of the Hudson crash against the cliffs with a newfound turbulence in his own chest. He thought of the way he had touched her chin, the proprietary warmth he had felt, and the cold calculation he had used to corner her. A dark obsession began to take root, twisting his sense of obligation into something far more complex and dangerous. He wouldn't just save her father, he would transform her. He would repay the debt by elevating her to a height she could never have reached on her own, even if he had to burn her old world to the ground to do it. He would not be her master, but her architect. He would protect the Hale bloodline with a ferocity that the city had never witnessed, but he would do so from behind the mask he had spent a lifetime perfecting. The latte spill was no longer a mistake. It was a divine intervention that had brought the daughter of his savior back into his orbit. Vittorio reached for the intercom, his voice steady once more, though his heart hammered with a rhythm he hadn't felt in decades. He summoned his lead investigator, his mind already formulating a new strategy that moved far beyond simple employment. "The Hale file," he said when the man entered the room. "Seal it. It does not exist. From this moment on, Seraphine is not an assistant. She is a guest of the highest order, and find the surgeons who declined her father's operation. I want their licenses revoked by noon and their clinics closed by sunset." He turned back to the window, his reflection ghostly against the glass. He had spent his life ending futures, but for the daughter of the man who saved him, he would build a kingdom. The dawn of silence had found a purpose that transcended power, and as the storm finally broke over the palazzo, he knew that the silence would never be the same again. The shift in the atmosphere of the palazzo was as sudden and jarring as the drop in cabin pressure on a failing aircraft. When Seraphine woke on her first official morning as a captive of the Calderon estate, she expected the harsh light of a servant's quarters and the cold reality of manual labor. Instead, she found herself in a suite that felt like a sanctuary of spun silk and polished mahogany, overlooking the restless, slate-colored waves of the river. There was no uniform waiting for her, only a wardrobe filled with clothes that bore the labels of designers she had only ever seen in the glossy magazines of first-class passengers. The confusion gnawed at her, a sharp contrast to the leaden weight of the contract she had signed. She felt like a bird that had been caught in a net, only to find the mesh was made of gold and the cage was lined with velvet. It was a psychological disorientation that Vittorio had crafted with the same surgical precision he applied to his business ventures. She was summoned to the conservatory for breakfast, a room of glass and wrought iron that seemed to float amidst the morning mist. Vittorio was already there, seated at a small, round table draped in white linen. He was dressed in a charcoal sweater that made his salt and pepper hair seem even more stark, and for the first time he was not surrounded by the usual phalanx of armed guards. The silence was still there, but it had lost its jagged edge, replaced by a brooding, watchful stillness. As she approached, he did not command her to sit. He waited for her to choose her own place, his eyes tracking her movement with a depth of intensity that made her skin prickle. The coffee on the table was steaming, the aroma rich and dark, a silent reminder of the accident that had brought her to this precipice. She sat across from him, her back straight, refusing to let the opulence of the room soften the resolve she had hardened overnight. "The terms of your employment have been refined," Vittorio began, his voice a low, melodic resonance that seemed to harmonize with the distant sound of the tide. He pushed a silver tray toward her, containing a tablet and a schedule that looked more like a curriculum than a job description. "You believed I wanted a maid, Seraphine. You were mistaken. I have no shortage of people who can clean floors or serve drinks. What I lack is a mind that has not been corrupted by the sycophancy of my world. You will be my personal assistant, but the role is more than administrative. You will be my shadow. You will sit in on my meetings, you will manage my private correspondences, and you will learn to see the world through the lens of the Calderon organization." He paused, his gaze locking onto hers. "To pay the debt of your father's life, you must become an asset of equal value. I am not buying your labor, I am investing in your potential." Seraphine stared at him, her mind racing to find the trap. "You want me to be a part of this?" she asked, gesturing to the estate and the invisible empire beyond its walls. "You destroyed my life because I wasn't professional enough for your standards, and now you want to bring me into your inner circle. It doesn't make sense, Vittorio. Why me?" She expected a cold rebuttal or a dismissive remark about her status, but instead, Vittorio leaned forward, the sunlight catching the sharp, weathered angles of his face. "Because you are the only person who has looked at me with genuine terror and genuine defiance in a very long time," he murmured. "Everyone else looks at me and sees a bank or a tombstone. You saw a man whose suit you ruined. That perspective is a rarity I find myself unwilling to discard. You will work to pay the debt, yes, but you will do so as a student of power, not a victim of it." The job he was offering was a gilded cage, a position that would weave her so tightly into his life that the line between employee and companion would eventually vanish. It was a brilliant, terrifying strategy. By elevating her, he was ensuring her loyalty through a sense of obligation that surpassed the legalities of the mortgage he held. He was offering her a seat at the table of the gods while holding the leash of her father's survival. Seraphine looked at the schedule: languages to learn, dossiers to memorize, protocols of the underworld to master. It was a transformation he was demanding, a systematic stripping away of the flight attendant who cared about beverage service and the birth of a woman who could hold the gaze of the dawn of silence without flinching. "And if I fail?" she asked, her voice a whisper of the old fear. "If I am not the asset you think I am?" Vittorio stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the linen tablecloth. He walked to the edge of the glass wall, looking out at the cliffs where the eagles circled the updrafts. "Failure is a luxury you surrendered when you signed that paper," he said, without turning around. "But I do not think you will fail. You have the blood of a survivor in you, Seraphine. You simply haven't had a reason to use it until now." He turned back to her, and for a fleeting second the ice in his eyes seemed to crack, revealing a glimpse of the debt he was secretly paying back to the ghost in the files. "Your first task begins at noon. A tailor will arrive to fit you for a new wardrobe. If you are to be my shadow, you must look like you belong in the darkness." He left the room then, his departure as silent as his arrival, leaving Seraphine alone in the glass-walled cage. She looked down at her hands, which were no longer shaking. The reality of her situation was settling in like a heavy frost. She was no longer a girl whose future had been canceled. She was a woman whose future was being rewritten by a master of the dark arts. She realized that the job was a test, a way for Vittorio to mold her into something he could keep by his side without violating his own rigid codes. He was turning his debt into a project, and her into a masterpiece of his own design. As she reached for the coffee, her fingers brushed the cold silver of the tray, and she knew that the innocence of the girl on the plane was gone forever. She was in the lion's den, but the lion wasn't eating her. He was teaching her how to hunt. She took a sip of the bitter brew, the heat of it anchoring her to the new, dangerous world she now called home. The lessons did not take place in a classroom, but in the crucible of high-stakes silence that Vittorio Calderon called his daily life. A week into her residence at the palazzo, the transformation began in earnest, moving beyond the silk dresses and the designer heels into the very architecture of Seraphine's posture. Vittorio summoned her to the grand study an hour before a midnight meeting with a consortium of shipping magnates who were as corrupt as the harbor water they sailed upon. He didn't look at her with the predatory gaze of a captor. He looked at her with the clinical, exacting eye of a master jeweler examining a raw stone. He told her to stand in the center of the room, far from the safety of the walls or the shadows of the bookshelves. "A victim seeks the periphery," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to command the very air to be still. "A player owns the center. If you want to survive this room tonight, you must stop apologizing for the space your body occupies." He walked a slow, deliberate circle around her, his footsteps making no sound on the ancient Persian rug. He corrected the tilt of her chin, pulling it upward until her gaze was level and unyielding. He told her that in his world, a blink was a confession of fear, and a fidget was a signature of weakness. "They will try to look through you because you are a woman and because you are young," Vittorio explained, stopping directly in front of her. "They will wait for you to look down or to tuck your hair behind your ear. Do neither. When they speak, you will not nod in agreement. You will remain as still as the statues in the garden. Power is not found in what you say, Seraphine. It is found in the things you choose not to reveal." He was teaching her the art of the vacuum, how to create a silence so heavy that other people would rush to fill it with their own mistakes and nervous admissions. When the men arrived, the atmosphere in the study turned jagged and cold. They were massive, loud men who smelled of tobacco and expensive gin, their voices booming with a forced bravado that Vittorio met with a terrifying, absolute calm. Seraphine stood at his right hand, a living shadow in a tailored black suit that made her blonde hair look like a halo of cold light. She felt the weight of their collective gaze, a mixture of dismissive lust and calculated curiosity. One man, a dockyard boss with a scar cutting through his eyebrow, directed a crude joke toward her, expecting the blush of a flight attendant or the flustered retreat of a servant. Seraphine felt the old impulse to shrink back, to offer a polite, nervous smile to diffuse the tension. But then she felt Vittorio's presence beside her, not as a shield but as a mirror. She remembered his words, "Stop apologizing." She did not smile. She did not look away. She fixed her eyes on the bridge of the man's nose and remained perfectly, unnervingly still. The silence stretched, the air in the room turning thick and unbreathable. The man's grin slowly faltered, then dissolved into a confused, defensive scowl. He shifted in his seat, his fingers drumming a frantic rhythm on the obsidian desk. He was the one who looked away first. Vittorio didn't say a word of praise, but the slight inclination of his head was more rewarding than any spoken accolade. In that moment, the power dynamic of the room shifted. Seraphine was no longer the girl who had spilled the latte. She was the woman who had stared down a wolf and watched him blink. She was learning that the greatest weapon in the Calderon arsenal was not a gun or a bribe, but the refusal to be moved by the chaos of others. As the meeting progressed, Vittorio involved her in the theater of the transaction. He didn't ask her to take notes like a secretary. He asked her to hold the dossiers and to watch the eyes of the men across the table. When the negotiations hit a stalemate over a particular shipping route, Vittorio turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Miss Hale, what do you see in Mr. Rossi's hesitation?" The question was a trap and a test. Seraphine felt the eyes of the magnates burning into her, but she didn't rush her answer. She took a slow, measured breath, channeling the cold stillness of the palazzo. "I see a man who is worried about his secondary investors, not his primary route," she said, her voice clear and devoid of tremor. "He's looking at the door, not the contract." The room went dead silent. Rossi's face turned a deep, mottled red, confirming her observation with a single, involuntary flinch of his jaw. Vittorio leaned back, a faint ghost-like shadow of a smile touching the corners of his mouth. "It seems my assistant has a keen eye for the truth," he murmured, his voice carrying the finality of a closing door. The deal was struck within 10 minutes on Vittorio's terms, and the men left the estate looking smaller than they had when they arrived. When the double doors finally clicked shut, leaving the two of them alone in the amber glow of the study, the silence felt different, no longer a cage, but a shared language. Seraphine let out a breath she felt she had been holding since she first boarded the private jet. She looked at her hands and was surprised to find they were steady, her pulse a calm, rhythmic drumbeat. She had played the game, and for the first time in her life, she had won. Vittorio walked to the sideboard and poured 2 glasses of water, handing one to her. His fingers brushed hers, and the heat of the contact was a sharp, electric contrast to the cold persona they had just maintained. "You performed well, Seraphine," he said, his voice losing its edge of command and replacing it with something deeper, something almost intimate. "You found the center. You realized that they cannot hurt you if you do not give them the map to your fears." He watched her for a long moment, the flint in his eyes softening into something that looked dangerously like pride. "Tonight, you stopped being a victim of circumstance. You became a player in the design." Seraphine took a sip of the water, the coldness of it anchoring her to the realization that there was no going back to the girl she used to be. The flight attendant was gone, buried under the weight of the palazzo's marble. In her place was something sharper, something Vittorio had forged in the dark. The nights at the palazzo were never truly silent. They were filled with the restless groaning of the ancient stone, and the rhythmic, aggressive heartbeat of the tide crashing against the cliffs below. Seraphine found herself wandering the upper corridors long after the house staff had retreated to their quarters, her mind a turbulent sea of new protocols and the lingering adrenaline of the previous night's meeting. She was becoming a creature of the dark, her senses sharpening to the subtle shifts in the estate's pressurized atmosphere. As she passed the heavy mahogany doors of the West Wing, a sound stopped her, a low, rhythmic thud followed by a sharp, pained intake of breath. It wasn't the sound of a man in control. It was the sound of a struggle. Guided by a mixture of concern and a burgeoning, dangerous curiosity, she pushed the door slightly ajar. The room beyond was a private gymnasium, illuminated only by the cold, blue light of the moon filtering through the high, arched windows. In the center of the room, Vittorio was working a heavy leather punching bag with a ferocity that bordered on the suicidal. He was not the polished don in the bespoke charcoal suit. He was stripped to the waist, his skin glistening with a thin sheen of sweat that caught the moonlight. Every strike was a controlled explosion, a desperate attempt to purge a demon that remained invisible to the world. As he turned to deliver a final, devastating blow, the light hit his back, and Seraphine felt the air leave her lungs. His skin was a roadmap of trauma, a jagged silver tapestry of scars that told a story of a life lived in the mouth of the beast. There were the puckered indentations of old bullet wounds, the long, raised ridges of blade marks, and most hauntingly, a cluster of deep, rope-like burns that mapped out a history of agony. These were not the trophies of a victor. They were the permanent records of a survivor who had paid for every inch of his empire in blood and skin. Vittorio sensed her presence before she could retreat. He didn't turn around immediately, his chest heaving as he leaned his forehead against the cool leather of the bag. "The palazzo has many ghosts, Seraphine," he said, his voice stripped of its melodic resonance, sounding instead like gravel grinding against silk. "Most of them stay in the walls. Mine stay on my back." He turned slowly, grabbing a white towel from a nearby bench, but he made no move to cover himself. He stood before her in the raw, brutal honesty of his physical form. Up close, the scars were even more terrifying. One particularly deep line ran from his collarbone down toward his ribs, missing his heart by mere millimeters. It was the mark of the ambush her father had saved him from, the physical manifestation of the debt that had brought her into this house. Looking at it, she didn't see the monster who had frozen her bank accounts. She saw a man who had been broken and rebuilt by the sheer force of his own will. "Who did this to you?" she whispered, her voice trembling as she stepped further into the room, the scent of cedar and salt-heavy sweat filling her senses. Vittorio looked down at the scars, a faint, bitter smile touching his lips. "The world did this," he replied, his gaze meeting hers with a vulnerability that felt more intimate than any touch. "Some were enemies, some were friends, some were the people I loved most before I learned that love is a luxury for the dead. Every mark is a lesson I was forced to learn in the dark." He walked toward her, his presence no longer predatory, but heavy with the weight of 30 years of isolation. He stopped just inches away, the heat radiating from his body in waves. "You see a don of silence, a man who moves the city like a chessboard. But beneath the silk, I am just a collection of healed fractures and old debts. I have spent my life ensuring no one could ever get close enough to leave another mark." Seraphine reached out, her fingers hovering just an inch from the jagged silver line on his chest. She expected him to flinch, to bark a command for her to leave, or to retreat back into the cold fortress of his persona. Instead, he remained perfectly still, his breath hitching as her fingertips finally made contact with the raised, cool skin. The scar felt like history under her hand, hard, unyielding, and ancient. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted yet again. She wasn't the victim, and he wasn't the master. They were two people bound together by a legacy of pain and a debt that had crossed through decades to find them. She looked up into his eyes and saw not the flint-colored abyss of the dawn, but the haunted, weary soul of a man who was tired of being a legend. The silence in the gym was no longer a vacuum. It was a bridge. "My father saved you," she said softly, the realization finally anchoring itself in her heart. "That scar, that's where the world almost won." Vittorio's hand came up, his large, calloused fingers covering hers, pressing her palm more firmly against his chest. His heart beat strong and steady against her hand, a rhythmic drum of survival. "Henry Hale gave me a second life," Vittorio murmured, his voice dropping to a near whisper that vibrated through her arm. "And for 30 years I have lived it in the cold, I thought I was protecting his gift by staying in the shadows. But then you spilled that coffee, and the light came back into the room. I didn't cancel your future to hurt you, Seraphine. I did it because I didn't know how else to keep the light from leaving again." The confession was a seismic shift in the foundation of her world. The vulnerability in his voice was a weapon more potent than any threat he had ever leveled against her. It dismantled her anger, leaving behind a complex, terrifying empathy. She saw the emotional scars now, the isolation he wore like a suit of armor, the fear of being seen, and the desperate, dark obsession with protecting the only thing that felt real in his monochromatic existence. He wasn't just her architect. He was a man seeking redemption in the wreckage of a life he had forgotten how to live. As the moon moved behind a cloud, plunging the room into deeper shadow, Seraphine didn't pull her hand away. She realized that the golden cage wasn't just for her. Vittorio had been living in it for decades, and she was the only one who held the key to the lock. The dawn of silence had finally spoken, not with words of power, but with the language of his wounds, and Seraphine knew that her heart was no longer as safe as she had thought. The Red Gala was not merely a celebration. It was a curated exhibition of power where the city's elite walked a tightrope over a pit of vipers. Held in the grand ballroom of the Metropolitan, the air was a suffocating blend of expensive lilies, aged bourbon, and the electric hum of unspoken threats. For Seraphine, the evening felt like a formal debut into a war zone. She wore a gown of deep, arterial red that seemed to glow against the monochromatic elegance of the room, a visual declaration that she was no longer a shadow, but a focal point. Beside her, Vittorio was a pillar of obsidian, his tuxedo tailored with such lethal precision it looked like a second skin. He didn't touch her, yet the proprietary weight of his presence was a constant heat against her side. He had taught her how to command a room, but as they descended the grand staircase, she realized the true lesson was about to begin: how to survive the wolves when you are the only one wearing the color of blood. The room fell into a practiced, respectful silence as they reached the floor, the kind of stillness that usually preceded a storm. Vittorio's enemies were everywhere, masquerading as philanthropists and city officials, their eyes tracking Seraphine with a predatory hunger. They didn't see a flight attendant or a personal assistant. They saw a weakness. In the world of the dawn of silence, a woman was a target, a variable that could be used to unbalance a man who had spent 30 years being untouchable. Vittorio navigated the crowd with the clinical grace of a shark, his nods brief, his words few. He introduced Seraphine as his executive associate, a title that carried the weight of a royal decree. Yet, beneath the veneer of civility, she felt the jagged edges of the tension. Every handshake was a probe, every smile a baring of teeth. She kept her chin high and her gaze level, remembering the cold stillness of the palazzo, but the sheer volume of the malice in the room made her pulse race with a frantic, rhythmic urgency. The first sign of the incoming tide came in the form of Julian Vane, a man whose family had been at war with the Calderons since before the concrete of the docks had dried. He approached them with a glass of champagne, his smile not reaching his cold, reptilian eyes. "Vittorio," he drawled, his voice a sharp contrast to the Don's melodic rasp. "I see you found a new treasure to guard. It's a dangerous time to be carrying something so fragile." The comment was a deliberate strike, a testing of the perimeter. Vittorio didn't flinch, his expression remaining as unreadable as a desert horizon. Stability is often mistaken for fragility by those who lack the vision to see the foundation. "Julian," Vittorio replied, his voice a low vibration that seemed to drop the temperature of the immediate area. He stepped slightly in front of Seraphine, a subtle, protective movement that signaled his intent to anyone watching. The message was clear. She was under the protection of the Dawn, and the price of touching her was total annihilation. As the night wore on, the gala shifted from a social event to a chess match. Seraphine found herself separated from Vittorio for a brief moment as he was pulled into a private alcove by a high-ranking senator. She stood by a marble pillar, her hand gripping the stem of a glass, feeling the eyes of the room boring into her. It was then she noticed the shift in the security detail. The men in the black ties, the ones who usually stood like statues, were moving with a new, hurried purpose toward the service entrances. A cold dread settled in her stomach, a primitive instinct that told her the vacuum was being filled by something violent. She scanned the room for Vittorio, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw him emerging from the alcove, but she also saw 3 men in waiters' jackets converging on his position from different angles, their hands not holding trays, but tucked into the small of their backs. The climax was a blur of motion and soundless intent. Seraphine didn't think, she reacted. She bypassed a group of socialites, her heels clicking a desperate rhythm against the parquet floor. "Vittorio!" she cried out, the sound of his name shattering the carefully maintained decorum of the ballroom. Her voice acted as a catalyst, breaking the tension like a gunshot. Vittorio turned just as the first man drew a suppressed weapon from his jacket. With a speed that defied his age, Vittorio shoved Seraphine behind the safety of a heavy stone pillar, his own hand moving to the holster concealed beneath his silk vest. The ballroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of shattering glass and panicked screams as the elite scrambled for the exits. The Red Gala had lived up to its name, the air now smelling of cordite and copper. Vittorio didn't retreat. He stood his ground in the center of the chaos, a god of the silent vacuum finally finding his element. He fired 2 precise shots, the suppressed muzzles flashing like angry fireflies in the dim light. The attackers fell with a terrifying efficiency, their bodies hitting the floor with a dull, final thud that was lost in the cacophony of the crowd. Throughout the entire exchange, his eyes never left Seraphine's, a silent tether of protection and shared adrenaline. He wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting for the bridge they had built in the darkness of the gym. As the sirens began to wail in the distance and his security team finally swarmed the room to secure the perimeter, Vittorio walked toward her. He was uninjured, but the charcoal silk of his sleeve was stained with a dark, wet spray that wasn't coffee this time. He reached out, his hand steady as he gripped her shoulder, pulling her into the hard, unyielding safety of his chest. "You warned me," he murmured, his breath hot against her ear, his voice carrying a raw, jagged edge of emotion he had never shown to the world. "You broke the silence to save me." Seraphine leaned into him, her body trembling with the aftershocks of the violence, the red of her dress blending into the shadows of the room. She realized then that the gala hadn't just been a trap for him, it had been a baptism for her. She was no longer a guest or a student, she was a partner in the wreckage. The Dawn of Silence looked down at the woman in his arms, and for the first time, he didn't see a debt to be paid or a project to be completed. He saw the only person who had ever stepped into the line of fire for the man beneath the silk. The enemies had moved in for the kill, but they had only succeeded in forging a bond that would set the city on fire. The aftermath of the Red Gala was a haunting symphony of sirens and the rhythmic, hollow echoes of boots on marble. Within the armored sanctuary of the limousine, the silence was no longer a weapon of intimidation, but a fragile veil over a raw, pulsing adrenaline. Seraphine sat beside Vittorio, her red gown stained with the soot of gunpowder and the dark spray of a war she had never asked to join. Her hands were still shaking, a visceral reaction to the moment she had screamed his name and changed the trajectory of the night. Beside her, Vittorio was a statue of dark, brooding intensity, his gaze fixed on the passing city lights. He looked at his hands, the hands that had taken lives to protect his own, and then he looked at the woman who had risked everything for a man who had once tried to erase her. The air in the car was thick with the scent of ozone and copper, a reminder that the line between life and death was as thin as the silk of her dress. "You should have run," Vittorio said, his voice a low, jagged rasp that broke the stillness like a blade. "When the shadows moved, when the steel came out, your instinct should have been flight. That is what I taught you. That is how survivors live." He turned to her, and for the first time the flint in his eyes was replaced by a turbulent, dark whirlpool of confusion and something that looked dangerously like gratitude. Instead, you stepped into the center. You made yourself a target to give me a second of warning. Why, Seraphine? I held the mortgage to your home. I held the debt of your father's heart. You owed me your labor, not your life. Our contract was written in ink, not in blood. The question hung in the pressurized space between them, a demand for a truth that went beyond the legalities of their arrangement. Seraphine looked at him, her reflection ghost-like in the tinted glass. The terror of the ballroom was receding, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. "You think everything is a transaction, Vittorio," she whispered, her voice gaining a strength that surprised her. "You think you can buy loyalty with a canceled debt or a golden cage. But you can't buy the moment I saw those men closing in. I didn't see a creditor or a don. I saw the man who sat in the dark of the gym and showed me his scars. I saw a man who was tired of being alone." She reached out, her fingers brushing the charcoal wool of his sleeve, right where the latte had spilled a lifetime ago. "Loyalty that is bought is just a lease. What I did tonight, that was a choice. It was the only thing I had left that you didn't already own." The confession seemed to hit Vittorio with the force of a physical blow. He reached out, his large, calloused hand covering hers, pressing it against the seat. The contact was electric, a grounding wire in the middle of a storm. He realized then that his systematic destruction of her life had failed in its ultimate goal. He had wanted to mold her, to control her, and to repay a debt through a sophisticated form of ownership. But Seraphine had bypassed his architecture entirely. By saving him, she had flipped the ledger. She was no longer the one in debt, he was. And for a man who had spent 30 years ensuring he owed nothing to anyone, the weight of that realization was staggering. He wasn't her master, he was her debtor. The girl who had spilled the latte had become the woman who had preserved his empire, and she had done it out of a terrifying, selfless empathy that he didn't know how to process. "The men who attacked tonight, they were sent by those who believe I have grown soft," Vittorio murmured, his gaze dropping to their joined hands. "They saw you as a weakness, a fracture in the armor of the Dawn of Silence. They thought that by targeting you they could destroy me." He looked back up, his expression hardening into a mask of lethal resolve. "They were wrong. They didn't realize that you aren't a weakness. You are the only thing in this city that is real." He leaned closer, the heat of his presence overwhelming her senses. "I spent 30 years building a kingdom of ice, believing that silence was my only protection. But tonight, your voice was the only thing that kept me alive. I cannot go back to the way things were. The contract is dead, Seraphine. The debt is forgiven, not because of your father but because of you." The words felt like the breaking of a spell. The invisible chains that had bound Seraphine to the palazzo, the mortgage, and the constant fear of failure seemed to dissolve in the quiet of the car. She was free. She could walk away, take her father to a new city, and never look back at the shadows of the Calderon name. But as she looked into Vittorio's eyes, she saw the silent plea of a man who was terrified of the vacuum he would return to if she left. He was offering her freedom as the ultimate sacrifice, a gesture of respect that cost him more than any bribe he had ever paid. She realized that the forgiveness wasn't just about the money, it was about the blood they had shared in the ballroom. They were bonded now by a truth that went deeper than any legal document could ever reach. "If the debt is forgiven," Seraphine asked, her voice steady and searching, "then why am I still sitting here? Why aren't you telling the driver to take me home?" Vittorio didn't blink, his grip on her hand tightening just a fraction. "Because I am a selfish man, Seraphine, and because I think you know that the world outside this car is smaller than the one we are building together." He reached up, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that felt like a revelation. "I am giving you the choice I never gave you on the plane. You can go, or you can stay and help me burn the men who thought they could touch what belongs to me." The choice was the final piece of the transformation. Seraphine looked at the blood on her dress and the man by her side, and she knew the answer. The flight attendant was truly gone, and the player had finally decided which side of the board she wanted to occupy. 6 months had passed since the shattered glass of the red gala had been swept away, yet the world that rose from the fragments was unrecognizable to the woman who now stood on the terrace of the palazzo. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of salt spray and the blooming jasmine of a garden that had once been a cold, manicured fortress. Seraphine looked out at the horizon, where the sun was a thin sliver of hammered gold, reflecting on the profound silence of her new reality. In the months following the attack, Vittorio had moved with the terrifying, silent efficiency of a man rewriting destiny. He had systematically dismantled every barrier he had placed in her way. Her flight credentials had been restored with a letter of apology from the airline's board. Her bank accounts were not only unfrozen, but bore the interest of a life she had once only dreamed of. Most importantly, her father's health had stabilized in a world-class facility, his mortgage burned, and the deed to his home returned to him in a velvet-lined box. Vittorio had kept his word with the absolute finality of a king, restoring the life she had lost to the very last penny. Yet as she stood in the stillness, Seraphine realized that the restoration was a ghost. She had been given back the keys to her old life, but she no longer fit through the doors. She thought of the girl who had been terrified of a coffee stain, the girl whose greatest ambition was a smooth transatlantic crossing and a steady paycheck. That girl had died the moment she looked into the scars on Vittorio's back and realized that power was not just about control, but about the terrifying responsibility of protection. The mundane concerns of her previous existence, the schedules, the service, the desperate need for approval from a system that would have discarded her in a heartbeat, felt like the trivial concerns of a stranger. She had tasted the cold, crystalline air of the heights, and the oxygen of the valley was no longer enough to sustain her. She had been forged in the dark, and she had discovered that she was not a victim of the shadows, but a creature meant to command them. Vittorio appeared at the terrace doors, his presence announced not by sound, but by the subtle shift in the atmosphere that Seraphine had learned to read like a second language. He was dressed in a simple white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the powerful, scarred forearms that had held her steady in the wreckage of the ballroom. He didn't speak immediately, joining her at the stone balustrade to watch the tide. He was a man transformed, the ice in his eyes replaced by a deep, brooding warmth that he only ever showed to her. He had offered her a private jet to take her anywhere in the world, a total release from the job he had once forced upon her. He was waiting for her to leave, to reclaim the innocence he had once stolen. But as he looked at her, he saw the same level, unyielding gaze he had taught her to cultivate. He saw a partner, not a servant. "The plane is fueled, Seraphine," he said, his voice a low, melodic resonance that felt like an anchor in the morning mist. "Your father is expecting you. Your career is waiting. The world is exactly as it was before you met me." He paused, his flint-colored eyes searching hers for a sign of the girl he had first encountered. "You are free to go back to the sunlight. You owe me nothing. The debt is not just forgiven, it is erased." He was giving her the one thing he had never offered anyone else, an exit without a price. It was the ultimate gesture of the man who had been saved by her father, a way to honor the bloodline that had given him a second chance. He was standing in the vacuum of his own creation, prepared to let the only light in his life walk away because his code demanded it. Seraphine turned to him, the wind catching her hair, her red scarf, now a silk remnant of a different life, fluttering like a flag. She looked at the man who had destroyed her world and then built a kingdom in its place. She thought of the high-stakes meetings, the silent victories, and the way her heart now beat with the steady, rhythmic pulse of a player who understood the design. She realized that going back to the airline, back to the small apartment and the small dreams, would be a slower, more painful death than any Vittorio could have devised. She didn't want the safety of the ground. She wanted the turbulence of the storm. She wanted the man who understood that a life without risk was a life without meaning. She reached out, her hand covering his on the cold stone, and she felt the familiar, grounding heat of his skin. "The girl you're trying to send back doesn't exist anymore, Vittorio," she said, her voice clear and devoid of hesitation. "You restored a life for a woman who no longer lives here. You taught me how to see through the illusions of the world, and now you expect me to go back to being a part of them." She stepped closer, the space between them disappearing as the sun finally broke over the cliffs. "I'm not staying because of a debt, and I'm not staying because I'm trapped. I'm staying because the horizon is wider from here." The dawn of silence felt the final fracture in his fortress of isolation. He didn't need to ask for her loyalty. She had offered him her future, a future she had chosen for herself. He reached up, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, his gaze locking onto hers with a proprietary, dark affection that promised a lifetime of shared secrets. "Then the palazzo will no longer be a cage," Vittorio murmured, his voice dropping to a near whisper as he pulled her into the hard, unyielding safety of his embrace. "It will be the seat of a new kingdom. We will not rule through the fear of the past, but through the strength of what we have built together." The new horizon was not a return to the old world, but a descent into a deeper, more powerful reality. Seraphine leaned her head against his chest, listening to the strong, steady heartbeat of the man she had grounded. The flight attendant was a memory, a ghost of a life that had been too small for the woman she had become. As the sun rose higher, casting long, golden shadows across the terrace, the Don and his shadow stood together, ready to face the world on their own terms. The latte had spilled, the future had been cancelled, and in its place, a legacy of blood and fire had begun.